Ever show up for work, like all ready to go, but then
Yeah.
there's no actual work for you to do. Like you're just kind of stuck.
Yeah, like in limbo.
Exactly. And that's what today's deep dive is all about. It's about a Philippine Supreme Court case that deals with that exact situation. We're going to unpack what floating status really means and what it means for your rights as an employee right here in the Philippines.
This case is especially interesting because it really dives into this whole concept of floating status. It's something that's pretty common in the security guard industry here.
Right.
But this case, it really drew a line in the
Yeah,
sand.
this is the case of Alan M. Andor versus Jamila and Company Security Services. So Alan, he was a security guard, and get this, he worked for this company for over a year.
Wow.
But they never actually gave him a post. Can you believe that?
That's wild.
It's crazy, right? And that's where this idea of constructive dismissal comes into play.
Yes,
It's like this legal term.
it's a tricky one.
It is. So basically, it means that an employer has made the working conditions so bad, so intolerable,
Right.
that the employee basically has no choice but to quit, even if they haven't officially resigned.
Exactly. It's like they're forcing you out without actually forcing you out.
Yeah.
And in this case, the court decided that keeping Allen in this floating status, and essentially benched, no real assignment
Right.
for that long, that was constructive dismissal.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't lawyers, and I'm putting myself in that category,
Score.
can you break down constructive dismissal a little bit more? Like, how do you even prove something like that?
Well, you're right. It can be tough to prove. The court really has to look at whether the employer's actions were deliberate. Like they were intended to make the employee miserable enough to leave.
Right, right.
And in Allen's case, keeping him in floating status for that unreasonable amount of time, that definitely fit the bill.
So how long is too long then? Like, even in the security guard world, there's got to be some flexibility, right?
Yeah.
You need guards on standby sometime.
Oh, absolutely. And to be clear, floating status itself isn't actually legal here in the Philippines.
Okay.
Security agencies, they often need a pool of guards ready to go, just in case.
Makes sense.
But the court, in the Andor case, they looked to Article 292 of the Labor Code for some guidance. Now, this article doesn't specifically talk about floating status, but it does say that an employer can only suspend employment for things like, say, a business closure for a maximum of 6 months.
Got it.
So they applied that same principle here, basically saying if you're going to bench someone for more than 6 months and you don't have a really, really good reason, you've crossed a line.
And in Alan's case, we're talking way more than 6 months.
Way more. He was left hanging for over a year with no real explanation.
Oh, wow.
And that's when things get even more interesting, because the company actually tried to claim they couldn't give Allen assignments because his security guard license was expired.
Wait, are you serious? They use that as an excuse for a whole year?
A whole year. But here's the kicker.
Okay, so let me get this straight. They basically left him hanging in limbo for all that time, trying to blame it on an expired license.
Right.
That wasn't even expired.
Exactly.
And then they fired him for insubordination.
Yep.
What does insubordination even mean in this situation? I mean, come on.
Right. You can't help but think they're just making things up as they go along.
Totally.
And that's why it's so important to understand your rights as an employee.
Yeah.
Because insubordination isn't just about, talking back to your boss or having a bad attitude.
Right.
It's a legal term. And here in the Philippines, we've got some pretty clear rules about it.
So what does insubordination actually mean then? Legally speaking, what does an employer have to prove to use that as a reason to fire someone?
Simply put, it means you've willfully refused to obey a direct order from your employer.
Okay. So far, so good. But there's got to be more to it than that, right?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where it gets a little more complex. That order has to be reasonable, lawful, and it has to be connected to your actual job duties.
So, for example,
Right.
if my boss told me to go outside and direct traffic,
Right.
even though I work in an office, that wouldn't be a lawful or reasonable order.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. And there's actually a department order. It's called Department Order 1401
Okay.
from the DLL, the Department of Labor and Employment. And it lays out some very specific rules for what makes a work order valid.
Makes sense.
Like, for one thing, that order needs to be clear, it needs to be specific, and it has to be given to the employee in writing.
So you can't just be walking down the hallway and your boss is like, hey, go do this.
Exactly.
Got it. So how does all of this connect back to Alan Andor's case? Specifically, those notices the agency sent him.
Good question. Remember how the agency was trying to say that Allen was being insubordinate by not coming back to work?
Right, right.
Well, the court took a close look at those 3 notices they used to make their case,
Hmm.
and they found some major problems with them.
I bet. Like, what did they find?
Well, first of all, the delivery of those notices was shady, to say the least.
Shady how?
They were sent super late, which completely contradicted the agency's claim that Allen was ignoring them.
Oh, wow.
And the timing, well, let's just say it seemed very convenient for the agency's story.
So they're saying he's ignoring their notices, but then the notices show up late.
Exactly.
Something doesn't add up.
Right. But even if we put aside the late delivery, there's another problem.
Yeah.
The content of those notices, remember how we talked about Department Order 1401 and those specific requirements?
Right.
Well, these notices didn't even come close. They just said, return to work.
Wait, seriously?
That's it.
Yeah.
No information about where he was supposed to report, what time, what he'd be doing, who his supervisor was. Nothing.
You're kidding. That's all the information they gave him.
Nope. No job description, no schedule, no details about the post, nothing that would actually allow Allen to follow their orders.
It's like handing someone a plane ticket that just says, go travel.
Right.
No destination.
Exactly. No dates, no times.
Wow.
It's unbelievable they even tried to use that in court.
So what did the court say?
Well, the court saw right through it. They knew exactly what the agency was trying to do, create this fake impression of insubordination after they'd already pushed Allen out with that whole floating status situation. It was a desperate attempt to cover their tracks, and it backfired big time.
So we've got this whole constructive dismissal thing, a bogus insubordination claim, and a security agency that seems to have a real problem with honesty.
It's a lot.
It is. So what happened? Did the court just say, bad agency, don't do it again?
Well, it would have been nice if it were that simple, but it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. They made the agency pay literally.
Oh, really? Like how? What did they have to do?
Well, remember, the court already established that the whole insubordination dismissal was bogus, right? So they went back to the standard remedies for constructive dismissal.
Okay, so for those of us who didn't go to law school,
Right.
what does that actually mean for someone like Allen? Did he get his job back?
Not in this case. And honestly, after everything that had happened,
Yeah.
going back to that same work environment wouldn't have been good for anyone.
Probably not.
Too much bad blood. But here's the thing, and this is important. Allen didn't walk away empty-handed. Not at all.
So no big dramatic ending where he yells, "You're fired. Just kidding. I quit."
No, nothing like that. But remember those remedies for constructive dismissal we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, the court ordered the agency to pay.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Allen got separation pay, back wages.
Okay, hold on. Time for a quick explanation, like you're explaining it to a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
What do those terms actually mean for someone in Allen's shoes?
Okay, so separation pay, it's basically like a financial cushion for employees who lose their jobs, but it's not their fault.
Got it.
It's meant to help them, pay the bills while they're looking for a new job.
Makes sense.
And in this case, the court, they based Allen's separation pay on how long he'd worked at the company, acknowledging that they basically cut his employment short unfairly.
Right. Now, what about those back wages? Does that just cover the time between when they officially fired him for insubordination, which we know was bogus,
Right.
and when the court made their decision?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of this case. The court didn't just calculate back wages from the date of that fake dismissal.
Right.
No, they went all the way back to when his floating status started, almost a whole year earlier.
Wow. Are you serious? So they had to pay him for all that time they kept him in limbo, even though he wasn't actually assigned to a post.
That's exactly right. The court made it crystal clear. You can't just bench employees without a valid reason and expect to get away with it.
I bet that really hit the agency where it hurts their wallets. But you also mentioned attorney's fees, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's a crucial detail.
How so?
Because it means that going after what's right shouldn't leave you broke.
Right.
It shouldn't cost you an arm and a leg to fight for your rights.
I like that.
And the court, they basically sent a message with that ruling, violating labor laws has consequences, real consequences.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered Allen's case pretty thoroughly, but let's take a step back for a second. What are the big takeaways here? What can our listeners learn from Allen's experience, even if they're not security guards?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Because even though this case might seem very specific to one industry, the lessons here are universal. And I think the biggest one is this: knowledge is power.
Love it.
You have to know what your rights are as an employee. That's the first step to protecting yourself.
Because not everyone's going to have a Supreme Court case to fall back on if something goes wrong at work, right?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to know the labor laws, those regulations in your specific field, and never be afraid to ask for help.
Right, like if you're not sure about something, reach out to DOLE, talk to a labor union, get some guidance.
Exactly. Get that support.
And what about documentation? That
Yeah.
seemed to be a game changer in Alan's case.
Oh, it made all the difference. Remember how the company tried to say Alan's license was expired?
Yeah.
They might have gotten away with it if Alan hadn't kept copies of everything.
Wow.
So keep track of everything: employment contracts, pay slips, performance reviews, even emails.
It's like that saying, if it's not documented, it didn't happen.
Exactly. That paper trail is your best friend, especially if you need to prove your side of the story.
This has been amazing. I feel like I learned a lot. So
Yeah.
to sum it all up, know your rights, document everything, and don't be afraid to speak up.
You got it. And if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember Alan Andor's case? He fought back and he won.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. We hope you've learned something new and feel empowered to advocate for yourself. Until next time, stay curious.